Total Screen proudly presents the Weekly Set Podcast with Tyson Gifford and William Rohrig. Episode 208, recorded June 1st, 2019. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Weekly Set, the official podcast of the Total Screen. I am your host. My name is Tyson, and joining me today, as always, is my partner in crime here at the Total Screen, William Rohrig.
Hello.
So, today, we don't have Game of Thrones to talk about. What are we going to do, Will? What are we going to do?
We're going to end the podcast. So this is it. There's no more Game of Thrones, so no more podcasts, so bye, everybody.
Good night. Well, since Game of Thrones has ended, we kind of said, what's going to be the next Game of Thrones? That's what everyone's asking.
I guess what we're really asking is, what's going to be our next obsession that's going to power this podcast for like 10 more years?
Yeah, not just our podcast, but just like the world of TV fandom, basically. Like it was Lost, and then it was Breaking Bad, then it was Game of Thrones. Like what's the next one going to be?
What's the next one? Is there going to be a next one? I don't know. Like it seems to me like something like Game of Thrones or something like Lost that's lightning in a bottle that can't be easily replicated. You can't just make another Game of Thrones. I think if you could, everybody would have done it and had massive hits on their hands. Same thing with Lost, or you can count the numerous times networks have tried to replicate the Lost formula. NBC even like attempted a Lost clone like this past season. Yeah,
what was it called? The one about the airplane flight or something that landed.
Yeah, that landed in the future.
Yeah. So there's these things always kind of happen where people are trying to look for the next one or something. It usually isn't a lot like the original one. Like, Lost was the huge one, then it was Breaking Bad. Breaking Bad's not very much like Lost.
No, well, it is exactly like Lost in that stuff.
in that people gather around the water cooler at work to talk about it.
Right.
Which is what we're really saying. We say we're looking for the next Game of Thrones. What we're really looking for is the next water cooler show.
We're looking for that show that captures the cultural zeitgeist, They either love to love it or love to hate it. Like Game of Thrones, and another thing, like Game of Thrones and Lost were both hugely divisive. You will get a lot of passionate debate over how much Game of Thrones sucks, especially later seasons, and there was the same problem, like how much the later seasons of Lost sucked, how much the last season of Lost sucked. I remember back then, like the last season of Lost sucked, the ending sucked, it was terrible, these writers are horrible. All the same criticisms that I heard for like this past season of Game of Thrones, I heard for the last season of Lost.
Yeah, it's a common thing you get. Whenever something gets to that big, you're going to have like a kind of a negative backlash to it.
Yeah.
But mainly, we said we want to find what's going to be the next one, or not necessarily find it, but we want to like kind of postulate what could be the next big one.
Right. If we could find it, we'd be mega producers. I'd want to cut. I definitely want to cut that.
So we kind of gathered up a list of like just a shit ton of shows coming to like Amazon, Netflix, HBO, all sorts of different places. And then I started kind of weeding it down, like narrowing it down to something we could manage on the show. And I said, there's just no way. There's too much. That's another thing that's changed. That's another reason why maybe we won't have a next Game of Thrones. Right. Is that there's so much stuff now, and it caters to such specific niches.
Yeah, because we no longer have just 4 networks and like maybe like 25 cable networks.
Yeah.
We have that plus all these streaming networks now on top of it, and the streaming networks are being very, very aggressive in pumping out content like you wouldn't believe. Like the world is running out of content.
Yeah. I think Netflix is putting out more original content, just original, not even counting the licensed stuff, than there are hours in the days that that allow them to put out that content.
There's definitely not enough time to watch all that shit.
Like, if you just started now and started only watching stuff as it came out on Netflix, like, okay, I'm gonna watch everything original that comes to Netflix, but only stuff coming out starting now. And I'm gonna start watching, you wouldn't be able to keep up. Like, it's an absurd amount of content for just Netflix.
When you do your week ahead segment, you're listing the new shows shows coming out this week on Netflix, and while you're doing that, they've already announced 50 more shows.
Yeah, it's absurd. It's absurd. And my list for like what's coming up in the week ahead is narrowed down. Like I cut out like reality shows. I cut out, like the movies. I only do the TV shows and stuff. It's like, so we're already severely cutting out stuff.
Yeah.
And still, it's like an absurd amount.
And so, of the shows that we are going to go over, I'm looking, we have 4 Netflix shows in the lineup.
Quite a few Amazon. I think there might actually be more Amazon shows.
Actually more Amazon, because Amazon is actually starting to go hard now, too. So,
yes.
So we got Amazon ramping up Netflix style. So we're set to where we're just going to have Amazon and Netflix pushing content like you wouldn't believe.
And that's causing everybody else to ramp up production too. HBO's, I think, is doubling the amount of original content that they put out before. And there's more streaming service providers popping up, and like HBO, other networks and other channels are doubling down on content to get more out to compete. And then we're getting more international content, which is a huge thing too. It's a big part of why there's so much on Netflix. Because Netflix took the bold and smart approach of saying, like, hey, let's make originals for these different countries that we sell our service in. And then since we have those originals, why not just put them over to the US as well?
Right.
And so you get like tons and tons more. It just magnifies. So we had so many on this list. And even when I trimmed it down and tried to go like, okay, let's try to be more reasonable. Even then I was still sitting at like somewhere over 50 shows. And then I said, you know what? We're going to do this for the next couple of weeks because Game of Thrones has ended. We don't have like a new catalog show that we're going to actively discuss. We don't have any specific topic that we're working on. And that's something we would have to think of anyways. So let's divide up this 50 something shows that we have coming up and do like say 4 podcasts, and each one we'll pick like a topic, and then we'll narrow down that list to fit into that topic. So we're starting, or genre I should say, we're starting today with fantasy series. So this is like, you want to say like the next Game of Thrones. This is like the most true to that statement, because it's like we're looking at shows that are really big, shows that could have big production budgets.
These are the direct wannabes in the vein of like every single supernatural mystery show that tried to be lost.
Yes, these are the ones that are fantasy series, that like Game of Thrones was. Like Game of Thrones, many of these are based off of like very popular book series. So yeah, that's where we're starting. We're starting with fantasy. So let's kick things off in the obvious place, which is Game of Thrones has ended. Long live Game of Thrones.
Yeah. And there are actually 5 spin-offs in the work, but there's only one that we really know any details about.
There's only one in production.
Yeah.
Like the rest are like in planning stages. But they have one show that's actually in production, and it's filming now actually, and that's what is being called Blood Moon. That's kind of like the only it's like a code name.
Oh, I didn't know they were adapting the Elder Scrolls 3 Blood Moon.
No, they just have this code name for now.
Swerve.
Like Game of Thrones, it's created by George R. R. Martin, is the original author of the material. But this is going to be a spin-off, an original story, and he's teaming up on this one with Jane Goldman, who was the co-writer on pretty much everything that Matthew Vaughn's done. If you've seen any of the Matthew Vaughn films, he did like the Kingsmen movies, X-Men First Class, Kick-Ass.
Those are actually pretty decent films too. Like the Matthew Vaughn stuff. Like Matthew Vaughn, he takes Mark Millar's material and he makes it digestible.
So this is, Jane Goldman. She works with Matthew Vaughn. She's like partnered with him. She's done some other things too on her own. And she has some other TV credits, but the big credits that you would look at her for in like genre stuff would be like Kingsmen and X-Men First Class.
Right.
That she was involved in.
Both decent movies. Both decent movies. X-Men First Class was probably the best of the post original X-Men trilogy.
And the last good X-Men movie.
And the last good X-Men movie, yeah. I mean, Days of Futures Past was all right too, but after that,
I still have my complaints about Days of Future Past.
First Class is definitely a better movie than Days of Future Past.
This series is going to be executive produced, and the pilot for the episode is going to be directed by, and before I even say that, it's important who directs the pilot of a series because they establish a lot of like the visual cues and tone of the show. Like they're involved in the visual aesthetic, creating that for the show. So the pilot episode is going to be directed by S.J. Clarkson, who has directed for quite a few TV shows, including Heroes, House, and Dexter. Not anything that like kind of blows your mind when you look at it. A lot of those are also shows that you look at and go, ooh, which episodes of that, you know? Yeah. Like, oh, she did some episodes of Heroes. That could be very good or very bad. She did some episodes of Dexter. Same thing. That could be very good or very bad.
Yeah.
But the thing to keep in mind is that a lot of times, you know, a director on a show, if they're not the first director, if they're not the pilot director, and CJ Clarkson didn't direct the pilots for any of those, if you're not the pilot director, you're just almost like a hired gun on a TV show.
Right.
You kind of come in, you do your job, and you leave, you know? And this is going to be, her chance to like actually be establishing the tone of the series.
And you know, Game of Thrones haters, you know, if you hated the last season of Game of Thrones, if you think D&D suck, well, D&D have nothing to do with this.
Yeah. So Dave and Dan had nothing to do with,
so maybe you could find your way to giving this a chance.
But George R. R. Martin did. He was directly involved with it. So if you were like, they went too far away from George R. R. Martin's direction and didn't, well, George R. R. Martin co-created this one.
Yeah, he co-created this spin-off. George R. R. Martin wasn't involved with the TV series too much, especially like
he wrote like one episode per season, I think, for like the first 3 seasons.
Yeah, for the first 3 seasons. I think after season 4, I read like he didn't have much involvement with the show other than consulting with D&D, which he described basically as like they just call him up and ask him like questions about things, and he'd just give like answers, be like yeah, and that's basically it. That basically became his involvement past season 4.
Yeah. He's directly involved in this. Who knows how much he's involved besides developing the initial thing. But it has the benefit of there is no source material, which means some people might see that as like a bad thing, but the good aspect of that is that it doesn't have anything to live up to.
Right, there's no
like
book.
It's not going to ruin a book character that you loved because all the characters in this are going to be pretty much original characters.
Right, yeah, there's no books detailing like this period, you know, in this level of detail, you know, other than, you know, Game of Thrones, the original book, like they give broad strokes about what happens during this time period, but that's about it.
So here's some more information we have that's going to take place in the Age of Heroes, which is roughly 10,000 years before the events of Game of Thrones. Here's some notable events from that era. There's going to be the foundation of several powerful houses, the Long Night and the White Walkers. So when you always hear about the Long Night taking place long ago, and you hear about the advent of the White Walkers, that's all in the Age of Heroes time. And it's also when the Andal invasion occurred, which is when most of Westeros was basically conquered. Like the first men had come over before, and then the Andals came from Essos and conquered most of it. What you're not going to see, or probably not going to see unless they like, you know, pull some big changes on us, are dragons or Targaryens at all. This is going to be a show focused on kind of like the establishment of Westeros. The Westeros we know, like the castles that are there, the families that we know, those family names. This is kind of like the origins of that. We have some information on who's going to be in this show, though. Naomi Watts is going to be taking the lead. She was, the last thing she was in that we kind of talked about, I think, was Twin Peaks: The Return.
Yes.
She played Dougie's wife.
She plays Dougie's wife in this, too. This is actually a spin-off of Twin Peaks as well.
It's Game of Thrones : Twin Peaks.
Yeah.
She's the only character that we have an actual character description, which is, it says a charismatic socialite hiding a dark secret. And that's all we have on her.
That kind of sounds like a Cersei Lannister-ish type character.
My theory that I have already, my early theory, is that she's playing Lan the Clever, the founder of House Lannister.
Oh.
And history's gonna have rewritten her as a man.
Yeah, I bet you're right. What a twist. I think, yeah, that makes sense.
So that's my theory. But some other people that are going to be involved, the other kind of major lead in the series is Josh Whitehouse, who is in Poldark. He's kind of mostly unknown, but he's going to be one of the leads in this. And then Georgie Henley from Chronicles of Narnia is going to be in it. Jamie Campbell Bower, who's been in a lot of genre stuff. He was in Twilight, which is going to make everybody that thinks the way I think scream in agony as they hear that somebody from Twilight's involved in this. He was also in Camelot, which was a Arthurian legend show on Starz. It was kind of, I think it started around the time the second season of Game of Thrones did. Something like that. I think it only lasted like one season. But a bunch of people that were in that ended up going to Game of Thrones, like a bunch of the actors and stuff. It was kind of funny that he took the long way around to it. But he was also in Harry Potter and the Fantastic Beasts series playing the young version of Grindelwald. And he kind of first got noticed when he was in Sweeney Todd, the Tim Burton one with Johnny Depp. So yeah, so he's been in a couple movies with Johnny Depp then. And he's been in Twilight and a King Arthur story and Harry Potter and a Tim Burton film. So he's kind of like the person you'd expect to see popping up in something like this.
Right.
And then lastly, we have Miranda Richardson, who played Rita Skeeter in the Harry Potter movies. And she's also in Good Omens, which just came out this week. So she's another good person to have on there. There's a few other people in the cast, but most of them are relative unknowns. Those are kind of like the bigger ones to pay attention to.
Right, right. But then again, when you think about the original Game of Thrones, the majority of the cast was unknowns and character actors, and there was
most of the bigger actors died pretty quickly.
Like Sean Bean was like the biggest name they cast, and
and the guy who played Robert Baratheon too.
Robert
I can't think of the actor's name right now, but he had some credits to him, and so a lot of the initial cast were kind of, besides them, were kind of relative unknowns. Littlefinger had been in The Wire though, which was another like critically lauded HBO series.
You look at the last episode of Game of Thrones, and you look who survived the series. It wasn't anybody who was big actors at the time.
Yeah. I think if any of them were any of the ones that survived were big.
Right.
I guess the closest would be Peter Dinklage.
Yeah, the closest would be Peter Dinklage, but
he was still kind of, he was only really known in like the indie scene, at the time.
Right, exactly. Like only really like the indie scene. He was like up and coming when that show came out. Yeah, so it's interesting. So it makes you wonder like whether Naomi Watts' role is that big or that long lasting to begin with.
Yeah, maybe she'll die off pretty quickly or something. Maybe she'll pull a Sean Bean, but who knows? I mean, this is completely different. This
is uncharted territory because there is no book to go off. There's no book I can go out and read and go, aha, I know what's going to happen now.
Exactly. So it'll be interesting to see how this goes, how fan reaction to it is. I'm just interested in like little details that people might find boring. Like, is this going to have the kind of budget that Game of Thrones had? Because Game of Thrones started off like a relatively, it had a decent budget, but it wasn't huge, and it just kept scaling up season by season.
But
I'm kind of wondering where they're going to kick off the spinoff with. If they're going to start, I doubt they're going to start at like Game of Thrones season 8 level budget.
No, they won't. They'll probably do what they did with Game of Thrones, where like the ratings will determine the budget.
I don't know if they'll go that low budget though, like a season 1 Game of Thrones. I don't think they're going to go that low budget, like because they know that they need to do at least a few flashy things to get some attention, and
right.
And so I imagine they'll probably have a decent budget. Plus, if they end up filming in Northern Ireland where Game of Thrones filmed, they have so many like costumes and sets and things that could aid in stretching their budget the most they can.
Right.
They could reuse assets. But yeah, so that's Game of Thrones. Like we said, that's Game of Thrones spin-off series Blood Moon. There are other Game of Thrones spin-offs in development as well, but this is the only one that we really know firm details on. It's also the only one that's like in production. The rest of them we might never see. I mean, they might never come to be, We just don't know. But also coming to HBO and coming fairly soon, it's coming this year, I believe, is His Dark Materials.
Yes, which is
it's based on the book by Philip Pullman, and this is previously been adapted to film before. There was a movie called The Golden Compass that's also the name of the first book in the trilogy.
So The Golden Compass was meant to launch a film series. It was a reaction to the success of Lord of the Rings.
And Harry Potter, yeah.
And Harry Potter, yeah. So the Golden Compass, the first book, got adapted into a film with plans for all the other books to be adapted into films. But the Golden Compass bombed. It bombed hard, and so a film series never happened.
Yeah, it didn't take off the way they had expected to. It was one of those big gambles, like, Harry Potter's so successful. Well, what's another British fantasy series that we can use so we have our Harry Potter? And it's like we're saying, the next Game of Thrones, the catching lightning in a bottle. It was the same situation with the movies that were trying to rip off Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter.
I'm wondering, have this material having already not caught on with the public consciousness, can they strike gold with their second attempt? I think
maybe, because it's TV, which means it's a little bit more accessible than film. Yeah. They get a few chances to kind of get it right in the first season. They don't have to knock it out of the park on the first episode, like a film, of course does. And they also, it's already an international co-production, which should help it, monetarily, at least initially. It's co-production between HBO and the BBC. Plus, it's got a few people in the cast that are gonna strike some interest. So, for anybody who doesn't know about the series in general, well, I should say that the TV series is going to be showrun by Jack Thorne, who was a writer for National Treasure, not the Nick Cage movie, but the Hulu series, and I think it was on Channel 4 in the UK. That's about a beloved, figure in the country that turned out to be a child molester. So it's loosely based on this real case from the UK. But it got a lot of attention. And so the political machinations and the idea of perception and stuff are there and might work in its favor. He also wrote for Skins in its first season, which is its best season. And he wrote for a series called The Fades that was kind of a supernatural type series that was fairly well liked.
Okay.
So he's got a little bit of a rep for him going in there. This series has already been picked up for a second season.
Okay, well then HBO is confident.
Yeah, HBO or the BBC are confident that it's got picked up for that. The story is basically, it's about an orphan in a magical world, and in this magical world, everybody has familiars, animals that are tied to them, spiritually connected. And this orphan discovers a big secret, and it makes her a target of powerful people. And then she kind of has to go on the run. So it's kind of, corruption, power, magic, some levels of science and discovery. And it was very Victorian, the first one. They're saying that this one, they're gonna modernize it a little bit. If you've seen the trailer, it doesn't look like modern day or anything like that at all. But they're saying modernized from Victorian a little bit.
Right.
The cast, though, is somewhat interesting. They have Daphne Keane is playing the lead role, the orphan, Lyra. She was less seen in Logan. She was the girl that was with Logan in Logan. So that young girl, everybody was kind of loving her when that movie came out. We'll see if people are following her career and if they follow her to His Dark Materials. Ruth Wilson is in it as Marissa Coulter. She may be best known for, alongside Idris Elba in Luther, if you've ever seen that series. She was also in the Showtime series The Affair. James McAvoy, though, is in it from X-Men First Class.
Of course.
And a bunch of other things. He's in it. And probably the biggest name in it.
From the hit film Split.
Yeah. And probably the biggest actual name in it is Lin-Manuel Miranda, Hamilton.
Yes.
So if you've heard of the Broadway sensation Hamilton, the star and playwright of that story is going to be in this series as well. He's actually attached to a few kind of fantasy projects. He's on another one that we're going to be going over on this list as well. He's not in it, but he's attached to it in a producer role. So that's kind of interesting. I think the trailer looks pretty good. Did you see the trailer? I
don't think I watched it. No.
Okay. They aired the trailer, I think, before one of the Game of Thrones episodes this season. I can't remember which, but it looks pretty good. They even have the polar bears in it. So they managed the budget for polar bears. And now, but they'll never pet the polar bears because that costs too much money, as we've learned from Game of Thrones.
Yes, that costs too much money. No polar bear petting.
That's the only reason some people would have tuned in, I think. Why isn't she petting the polar bear? God damn it. This is the worst show ever. But that's his Dark Materials. We're going to move away from HBO now and talk about an Amazon series. Some would say the Amazon series.
Some would say some would say, some would say it's insulting to call this a Game of Thrones wannabe.
Yeah. It all depends on how it's made, though, right? Because
yeah, it all depends on how it's made. Well, it's funny because we're saying, can this be the next Game of Thrones? But over a decade ago, everything wanted to be the next this.
Yes. And that's in film. I mean, in books, it's the same thing. Basically, every fantasy thing here based on a book, pretty much, except for maybe one. I think there's one on here that might be older or around the same age. Or actually two, I think. They're all of them were billing themselves as the next Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
And so that's, of course, what we're going to be talking about now, which is the Lord of the Rings project at Amazon.
So it is kind of odd to be calling the Lord of the Rings the next Game of Thrones, because, even Game of Thrones, even George R. R. Martin has to admit that Tolkien influences are in his writing, in his novel,
Yes. Definitely, and just in fantasy in general, Tolkien's like the godfather of the whole genre, in a sense.
Right, exactly. This is Lord of the Rings. So Amazon wants to enter the game, and they want to enter big. Jeff Bezos is a madman with way too much money.
Yeah, they basically bought their way into the fight.
Yeah, they bought it. So they spent an absurd amount of money to get the rights to this.
$500 million just for the license.
Yeah, $500 million just for a license. Never mind actually going into production on the show. And you better believe they're spending HBO Game of Thrones money on this project, like right off the bat.
I think the combined budget, including the license, has been written at about $2 billion, but that's, I think, for like something like 5 to 7 seasons or something. So that's a lot, but it's spread out,
Yeah, spread out.
So, of course, Lord of the Rings, written by J.R.R. Tolkien, last adapted as, Peter Jackson did both the Lord of the Rings trilogy and The Hobbit as a trilogy for some reason.
Yeah, which did not go over so well, The Hobbit.
Yeah. This series is going to be showrun by J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay, who are the writers of the next Star Trek movie.
Oh, okay. I guess I can't criticize because that movie's not out. But.
Yeah, they were involved in the writing on the last one, but they weren't the writers.
Okay.
And they have a few credits, not too big, but this is kind of going to be their breakout thing. Kind of Dan and Dave were the same way though for Game of Thrones.
Yeah, you didn't know who Dan and Dave were before Game of Thrones, so you never know. You don't know. You gotta give people a chance. They could surprise you.
We don't really know much about this series. We know it's supposedly set in the Third Age.
Right.
Which means it could depict the war between the Witch King and Gondor.
I think from what people have told me, because I'm not really like super knowledgeable about Lord of the Rings lore, but this is like apparently this is an era where Sauron is at the height of his powers, and he's making the rings and he's giving them to people.
I'd heard kind of different. That this is after his fall and before he's built his power up to become formidable again.
Oh, okay. I don't know. I'm not super knowledgeable about like the Third Age.
So it's going to be more like the Witch King is going to be more, I think, the villain of it. Okay. He was in the Lord of the Rings movies.
Right.
He's the head of the men that were turned into Asgul or whatever they were called, the Asgul kings.
Okay.
He's the the magic guy of that group of kings. The one that was killed by the woman in the last movie.
Right.
Because she was no man, and no man could kill him.
It's been so long since I watched those.
So it might depict him as kind of the central villain. But yeah, there's not a lot of information. Yeah, that's all speculation based on the age it takes place in.
Right. The Third Age. I know like people who are like way more knowledgeable about this stuff. You could probably like, I'm sure like people could just see the words the Third Age and write essays about what's going to happen.
Yeah. Tolkien left a lot of insular material for his works. So there's a lot of mythology and a lot of like source material there to draw from.
So, but the danger of this being the Lord of the Rings is that there are expectations around it, like high expectations, and if they don't meet, if they get things wrong, or if they mess up a piece of lore, people are gonna they're gonna catch shit. from.
Yeah, and Amazon's already investing billions, so
it's high pressure.
Yeah, and also there's rumors around about the fact that they have like a locked door with a security guard, and they're blocking like so that like there can be no leaks, and everything's like super tight security. Amazon is treating this like a new product, less like a show on Prime and more like a whole new tier like Prime itself.
Right. This is a show that Amazon is hoping propels Prime into that next level of this is a must-have service.
Yes. And that's pretty much all we know about it.
Right.
So next up we have The Witcher, which is coming to Netflix.
Now,
Hold on first. This is based on the novels by Andrzej Sapkowski, who his novels are also the basis of the video game franchise.
Okay. You basically said what I was going to say.
Sorry. But yeah, so people are going to mostly think about The Witcher. They're going to think about the games. The games kind of take place, I believe, after the events of the novels.
So the games, so this is not based off the games. This has nothing to do with the games. The games are just another adaptation of the novels, completely separate from this. So I know like they're famous here for being video games, probably more famous for being video games now, to the chagrin of the novel's original author. Like he's actually not happy about the fact that the games kind of overshadowed his work. But just forget about the video games because this is adapting the novels. And so really what you want to look at when looking at the show is what was in the novels, what happens, the versions of the characters that appear in those novels.
This series is going to be run by Lauren Schmidt Hissrich, who wrote episodes of Daredevil and The Defenders, a few other things, nothing really to draw too much attention from. I don't think she's ever been a showrunner before.
I haven't heard of her.
And it's going to, the basic story is that it's a solitary monster hunter who becomes connected with a sorceress and a princess.
Right.
That's kind of like the most basic way you can describe the story. One of the biggest things about this series that kind of lends credibility to it right off the bat is that they landed one hell of a lead. They basically stole Superman.
Apparently Henry Cavill is a huge fan of The Witcher. He said in an interview, like, before he got cast in this and everything, he apparently was obsessed with the game, The Witcher 3, The Wild Hunt. He said he's beat it several times. So he's apparently self-professed huge fan of the material, and I think he was, I think when he found out this was being made, he lobbied for the role and he won it.
Yes. So Henry Cavill is going to be playing the lead role of Geralt of Rivia.
So it's funny because we say, they got a pretty big name, but the producers didn't have to go out of their way to get it. It seems like he threw himself at them.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a good first sign, though. A lot of the other roles are kind of being played by basic relative unknowns. The girl playing Princess Ciri is Freya Allen. She's most known as providing a voice for the animated series Sherwood, which I think is like a children's Genderfoot Robin Hood series or something. And then Anya Shalatra, if I'm getting that right, probably not. Her biggest credit is that she was in a single episode of Into the Badlands.
I love this. Like, basically there's Henry Cavill and then there's unknowns.
Yeah, a lot of unknowns. But this one's playing Yennefer, who's another major character in the games, popular one.
Right.
But yeah, so that's The Witcher. I think it's expected to be out in 2020. They've been filming. They've been doing tests and filming. There's been some footage released of basically screen test footage, no trailers or anything like that. They got some kind of mostly negative reaction, I think, but it was a screen test. It wasn't footage from the show, But some people were comparing Geralt's armor to synthetic leather.
Oh yeah.
I know there's also been some kind of a backlash because the showrunner is a pretty staunch feminist, and apparently most of her writing staff, or if not all of it, is female. So there's been some kind of concern, of course, with, certain groups of people about that they're ruining my Witcher. They ruined my Witcher.
They ruined my Witcher. Oh, damn. Damn them.
But we'll have to see. I'm not going to judge something like that until I see something from it, something real from it, not a screen test, but an actual trailer, or something. I'm interested in seeing what the hubbub's all about.
Sure.
Next up, we have another Amazon series, Conan the Barbarian.
Now Conan does predate Lord of the Rings, so
Yes.
this character is not in the Tolkien tradition at all, because it predates Tolkien by at least The Hobbit by several years, because Conan was created by writer Robert E. Howard in 1932. The Hobbit was published in 1937. So
this predates a lot of the kind of mythological creations for fantasy that Tolkien established. Like, the way we perceive elves in fantasy now is heavily based on things that Tolkien decided on.
Right.
Before that, they were basically like gnomes, kind of.
Yeah, they're basically gnomes. And Conan is decidedly more gritty than Lord of the Rings or like anything here, basically. You know, like, it's a barbarian dude running around beating the shit out of people and conquering people.
Cutting things in half and stuff.
Things in half, yeah.
And then making out with half-naked women, yeah.
Yes.
That's kind of Conan in a nutshell. So this version of Conan is going to be run by Ryan Condal, who was one of the showrunners on Colony, which was a USA show that starred Josh Holiday from Lost, who played Sawyer in Lost. And it was a show about like kind of an alien occupation. So yeah, I mean, it was a decent series. I kind of stopped watching it just because I ran out of time. It's one of those things I cut from my schedule because I had too many other things I was watching. Not because it was bad, but just because I just didn't have time. So yeah, I'm kind of interested. He hasn't really done anything like huge though. That series wasn't like big on a scale like Conan would have to be. But the name that is attached to this that's fairly significant is Miguel Sapochnik, who is a director for Game of Thrones.
He did the Bells, right?
He did the battle episodes. So
yeah,
he did the Bells. He did the Long Night, Battle of the Bastards, Hard Home.
And when you think about like all the battles Conan can get into, having a director that specializes in epic battles like Miguel Sapochnik, that makes it sound promising, right? Because
yes.
At the very least, they'll be visually spectacular.
Yes, it should be. Unless Amazon like somehow blows it and gives them like $2 for their budget.
Oh yeah, because they spend all the budget on Lord of the Rings, so he's got like $5.
But for anybody who doesn't know Conan the Barbarian, well, just get the Schwarzenegger movie and check it out. Yeah, or you can see the Khal Drogo version.
Yeah, you can watch the Khal Drogo version. I don't know how good that was, but the Schwarzenegger films are classic.
Yeah, it's following a barbarian who's traversing civilization after being driven out of his tribal homelands.
Right.
So it's a barbarian dealing with like slightly more civilized people. And just being a barbarian.
And
there's sorcery and witchcraft and paganism.
You know what? And paganism. And you know what? It's fucking awesome, especially if you're just a fan of straight up action. Like Conan the Barbarian is like basically the John Wick of fantasy. So
yeah, you could say that, yeah.
Yeah,
so, it'll be interesting to see like how they do this as a TV series, because as a TV series they got to do some kind of character development.
yeah, exactly.
But it is based on a fairly famous book series, so maybe we're just going to get the most loyal adaptation yet. Who knows? Our next series is another huge one. This is another series that you wouldn't say is a ripoff of Lord of the Rings, because it didn't predate Lord of the Rings, but the authors basically were friends and coexisted at the same time, which is the Chronicles of Narnia.
It was a contemporary series, and it doesn't have elves or...
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's a Chronicles of Narnia. There's a lot of criticism, makes this, there's a lot of criticism as this being basically heavy-handed propaganda for Christianity. There's a lot of allegories to Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
We know like C.S. Lewis was apparently like a hardcore Catholic, so there is criticism of the series for that.
Yeah, there are some pretty heavy-handed religious references. It's still a fairly beloved series. They did this as a movie franchise. I think they got 3 movies in. But what's interesting is that at no time did they own the rights to every book in the franchise. So that they were starting this franchise. Again, this is one of the ones that they were starting up around the time of Lord of the Rings to compete with Lord of the Rings. But at no time did they own all the books, all the rights of the books. So they couldn't even if they had done well enough to complete the series, they didn't have the rights to do it.
Right, they didn't have the rights to do it. Yeah.
There's apparently some pretty tricky issues with the rights for the books, but Netflix, who is the one producing the series, is the first time that anybody's ever owned the entire rights to the series. So Netflix does have the rights to the entire series, so they could do the full run.
Okay, I was wrong. C.S. Lewis wasn't Catholic. He was a member of the Church of England. He was Anglican.
He's still very religious.
Yeah, he was still very religious, but I just do want to make the correction because I looked it up, and C.S. Lewis was not Catholic. It was Tolkien who was Catholic, but not C.S. Lewis. So to like anybody listening to this who was ready to crucify me over that, no pun intended. I just want to issue the correction.
So I don't think there's been a showrunner attached yet to this adaptation. I know that Mark Gordon is a producer on it. He's done a bunch of stuff, including, I put down Reaper on my notes here just because I like that show. Douglas Gresham is involved. He's C.S. Lewis's stepson, his adopted stepson. And Vincent Sieber, who worked on a movie called The Hive, or a series called The Hive, I don't know. Might end up being the showrunner for this, I'm not sure. But this is still fairly early on. There's not a lot of details available. What we do know is that the entire series has been licensed for the first time, and that this is another instance where they're trying to do both movies and a show, but the movies are going to be Netflix originals as well.
Okay.
Because it's Netflix, so.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you don't know Chronicles of Narnia, it's a group of siblings.
It's
around
very
World War II
famous.
Era. They travel to a different world through a wardrobe.
Basically, it's been a pop culture. It's parodied in The Magicians. We talk about The Magicians.
Yeah, Fillory is basically Narnia for adults.
Yeah. Fillory is basically, it's supposed to be
Narnia with sex.
Yeah, Narnia with sex, yeah. It's a complete parody of Narnia.
But yeah, so this is another, there's several instances though of shows on this list that are somehow connected to this whole both movies and show thing. That kind of makes me a little nervous, but because all the movies are going to be through Netflix as well, and because the way Netflix releases it all at the same time, it could be a little bit easier, it might work a little bit better than some of these other attempts.
Yeah, it could. We'll have to see how it comes out.
But there's, again, not a lot of details available for this.
Yeah, that's the problem with a lot of this. It's hard to judge what's going to take off next because not a lot of information on a lot of these shows,
It's just the names of the people attached to it and the properties themselves.
Exactly.
So our next one up is another one of those movie and TV series thing. And this is the Kingkiller Chronicles. This is actually one of my favorite book series.
Okay, I'm not very familiar with this, to be honest.
So it's by Patrick Rothfuss. He's the author of this series. He was a new author when he did it. Very good books, very strong world building. This series is coming to Showtime. So this is Showtime's attempt to take on Game of Thrones. Or as in Dexter was Showtime's attempt to take on Sopranos,
Yeah.
So now Kingkiller Chronicles is their attempt to take on Game of Thrones. So, as I said, this is
problem with Showtime is their shows start off strong and then tend to degrade in quality as time goes on.
Yeah, well, it all depends on who's involved.
Yeah.
And who stays involved. That was the problem with Dexter, is that the original showrunner left after season 4.
Right.
And that's when it took its dip,
Right.
But yeah, what's interesting here though is that they are making a movie trilogy, I guess. And that's gonna follow the book series. So the movies are going to be the books, and the TV series is just going to be set in the same world.
Huh.
But it's new material. And since world building is the strength of Patrick Rothfuss, the author of the series, then that can actually work, quite well. The movies, though, Sam Raimi has signed up to direct the first one at least. Okay. So that's an interesting name attached to it,
That's interesting. Yeah.
He was originally attached to Warcraft before that ended up going a different direction.
Oh, jeez.
But he was originally going to do that. And I think he would have probably done the best version of Warcraft because it probably would have been had a lot of humor in it,
Right. Yeah, definitely.
But it's going to be interesting to see how he does Kingkiller Chronicles. I'm really excited. I'm actually a pretty big Sam Raimi fan, going way back to Evil Dead series, I'm interested to see how he's going to do that. I'm also interested in what the TV version's going to be. This is the one I had mentioned when we talked about Lin-Manuel Miranda. He's attached as a producer for both the TV series and the movie.
Okay.
And he's a consultant for the music as well.
Interesting.
He posted kind of a funny picture, I think, when when it was announced that he was involved, where it was him holding a lute, because the main character plays the lute, basically. Music's a big part of the book series. And it's just kind of him holding it, there's a picture of Lin-Manuel Miranda, holding a lute, looking at it kind of confused, and saying, I gotta learn this thing, or something. But yeah, it's the people attached to Showrun are John Rogers and Jen Court, as well as Robert Lawrence. So John Rogers and Jen Court worked on like Leverage and The Player, which was like a short-lived but very stylistic show on NBC. And Robert Lawrence, he's like a movie producer, so I don't think he's going to be directly showrunning so much as just producing. But he's been involved in stuff like Clueless and Ghostbusters, Karate Kid. So he's pretty big, producer name for this,
Big time Hollywood producer.
Yeah, it goes back to some of the 80s and 90s classics. So it's kind of like the right person you'd want attached in that kind of role, not as like a showrunner, but as a producer attached. But yeah, I'm very curious about this. I love the book series. I'm really excited that Sam Raimi is doing the films. The TV series kind of has me a little perplexed, because it's just gonna be in the world of it. It's gonna be its own story and stuff. I'm just really curious where that's gonna go.
Yeah, that's gonna be interesting. I don't know.
So we'll just have to see. And Showtime's interesting because I remember Lionsgate had bought the rights to this franchise, and then very like around the same time they merged with or bought Starz, and I was like, oh, okay, so they're gonna do Kingkiller Chronicles on Starz, and then they later announced it for Showtime, and I was kind of like, okay, this is kind of throwing me. I don't know what to expect on this. Like I have high hopes, but at the same time I have big concerns.
I don't know.
It's a fantastic book series though. The first book's called The Name of the Wind. So if anybody's listening and wants a really good fantasy book series to start out, Kingkiller Chronicles is a really good one. Name of the Wind is the first book in the series. Next up, we have another huge fantasy series, heavily beloved, also from Amazon. Amazon just bought the rights to like every big fantasy series, basically. And that's The Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time.
It's based on the novels by Robert Jordan, who sadly passed away before he was able to finish the books. But they brought on Brandon Sanderson, who's another fantastic fantasy author. He did like the Mistborn series and stuff, and he's done some good stuff that I really enjoy. But he became involved to finish off the book series. So the book series finally got finished off after the author had died.
Oh, wow.
So this is kind of like the nightmare scenario for Game of Thrones fans,
Yeah.
If George R. R. Martin dies, like who kind of takes over? I think if George R. R. Martin died, like it might be like Patrick Rothfuss from the Kingkiller Chronicles that would take over for him.
That would take over.
But in this case, for the Wheel of Time, it was Brandon Sanderson who took over for Robert Jordan.
Okay.
The showrunner is Raph Judkins, who had worked on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., Hemlock Grove, the Netflix horror series, and he worked a little bit on Chuck, the NBC series.
Huh.
So that's some good stuff to be attached to. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is a good show. Hemlock Grove is kind of weird. Like, it's some people like it, some people don't. Chuck was good, but none of those are showrunner credits. Those are all like producer-writer credits, so be interesting to see if this person works as a showrunner. The pilot is going to be directed by Uta Brieswitz, who has directed episodes of Stranger Things and Westworld. So that's good right there, Unless the credits are for that one episode of Stranger Things. Let's just hope it's not for that one episode of Stranger Things.
Oh, right. Yeah, exactly.
The Wheel of Time is an epic fantasy, and it's set long after the collapse of an ancient civilization. And the current civilization is kind of like at about a Renaissance level of technology. But the previous civilization that collapsed was like maybe modern, maybe slightly more advanced than modern. So it's kind of an interesting setting. It's a little similar to setting-wise to, what was that? The Shannara Chronicles, which was that one series that had, what's his name from Spartacus and Arrow?
Yes.
Manu Bennett.
Yeah. That was MTV's attempt at having a big fantasy series, and it didn't exactly go the way they planned.
It was a little too teeny boppy to be taken very seriously, but it also had that kind of like fantasy setting, but also like the ruins of like a modern civilization.
Well, Shannara was a big fantasy novel series that they were adapting. So this was one of the earlier attempts to be the next Game of Thrones that just didn't pan out.
Yeah, it just wasn't able to get the kind of fan base.
Right.
The next one here is another big one, and this is also kind of along the lines of the whole like movie and TV show thing, but in a different way, because they tried to do it as a movie and TV series project, except the movie flopped so hard that they basically just said, okay, well, let's just start from the ground up for the TV series.
The movie was just garbage. Like, like this is one people have been wanting forever, and they make the movie and they just make it complete garbage. Like, what the fuck was the point?
This is The Dark Tower by Stephen King.
And I'm sitting here going, please be good, please be good, please be good. Please be good. Don't
and
be
it wasn't good.
No, I'm with the series here, with the Amazon. Oh. Like, please, because that movie was terrible, and that was like that was the biggest troll, you know, to make people wait all those years for a Dark Tower movie, and then just to make that crap. You're just trolling people at that point.
The interesting name attached to this is Glenn Mazzara, who was one of the showrunners on The Walking Dead. The Walking Dead went through quite a few showrunners in its early years.
Yes, it did. I think Glenn Mazzara was maybe the second or showrunner for the series.
I think he was like the second or third showrunner on the series.
I remember him being on Talking Dead like very, very early on.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see what he does with it. He's obviously has experience with adapting a major franchise from a source material, you know? So with The Walking Dead.
You say like Glenn Mazzara was the showrunner for Walking Dead when Walking Dead was good. Because I think that period between like season 2 and season 4 is when the show was at its best.
Yeah, when it was kind of more character focused and
right.
So it'll be interesting to see. That's a name attached to it that holds some weight because The Walking Dead, you know, I mean, it's kind of lost a lot of its luster,
right?
But at one point it was like the biggest thing on TV.
Yeah, it came out like 2 years before Game of Thrones, and so there was a period where The Walking Dead was the thing on TV before Game of Thrones kind of overshadowed it.
Well, even when Game of Thrones was on, they were kind of in a pretty heated competition between the two.
They were, because it was still for a long time Walking Dead was still getting like monster ratings.
Yeah.
It
wasn't really until like the last like maybe 3 years that Game of Thrones, or 3 seasons I should say, that Game of Thrones really just completely put The Walking Dead in its shadow.
Yeah. Well, and also I think that's more the fault of The Walking Dead because it just became a worse show. Like they killed off like most of the fan favorite characters. I think I saw like the ratings really drop after they killed Glenn, you know? Mm-hmm. Like people really loved that character, and when they killed that character off in that fashion, going by the ratings, seemed like a lot of people just dropped the show.
Yeah, I stuck with it a little longer than that, but I eventually dropped myself. But I'm really interested in how the Dark Tower is going to work, especially when you see like how the direction the film took and
just don't take the
Glenn Mazzara's history.
Apparently this is going to be a prequel series mostly concerned with Roland's world and Roland's history, you know, more so than the events of the actual novels. This history, this backstory is covered extensively in Wizard and Glass, so you might even say it's more of an adaptation of Wizard and Glass than the series as a whole.
At least how it starts.
Yeah, at least how it starts. I'm hoping eventually it starts covering more of the stuff with Roland, you know, the drawing of the three and crossing over into our world and the major conflict with the Man in Black, rather than just being entirely set in the backstory, you know.
This one features Sam Strike from Night Flyers, the short-lived sci-fi George R.R. Martin adaptation, as Roland the Gunslinger, and then Jasper Pakonen, who was last in Black Klansman, is suspected to be playing the Man in Black, who's taken on different visages throughout the books, apparently. So
right.
He's a visage of the Man in Black, basically. Or expected to be. I think that one's not confirmed. Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how they do this, how much connective tissue they leave in, because that was one of the big things about the Dark Tower is there's a lot of connective tissue to other Stephen King works.
Yeah.
Of course, Stephen King's like stuff is licensed out in different directions, so it'll be interesting to see what they can make connective tissue for.
Yeah, because if you read the books, like all through the books, the characters visit other Stephen King worlds, or characters from other Stephen King novels show up in unexpected places, and there's connections all over the place.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's an interesting prospect. It's something that people have been really wanting to see come to fruition for a long time. It's another one of those projects that have been called like an impossible project,
right?
Like Watchmen and Game of Thrones were both. Dark Tower is another one.
But it's not impossible when you decide to just say fuck it, jettison like everything that made it great and just make a pile of shit.
Yeah. what's also interesting is, like I mentioned, we talk about there's this trend now of making, movies and a TV series and are connected and, like that whole kind of thing that we're seeing with the Kingkiller Chronicles, for example. The Dark Tower was kind of like the start of that. And they announced that and everybody was like, that's crazy. You're actually going to do that? That's crazy. And then the movie came out and it flopped hard and people hated it. And they just completely abandoned that and completely backpedaled and said, okay, no, we're just going to turn this TV series into a complete fresh start.
Yeah.
we're not going to tie to this movie at all.
Yeah. Thankfully, that's the reason I have hope, because it's not tied to that movie.
All right, we got 2 left here. Next up is Cursed. This is coming to Netflix. It's based on the graphic novel by Frank Miller and Tom Wheeler.
So I had never heard of this, but it sounds pretty interesting.
Are you know who Frank Miller is. Are you aware who Tom Wheeler is?
I know I don't know Tom Wheeler. I'm sorry.
So I guess he's the artist for the graphic novel, but oddly enough, he's going to be serving as showrunner.
Huh, okay.
Which is kind of strange. I was looking that up. I was having trouble finding the showrunner, and then I finally found something saying Wheeler himself was going to be acting as showrunner. I'm like, oh, that's interesting.
Frank Miller probably didn't want to do it.
No, I doubt it, yeah.
I doubt it.
Zetna Fuentes, who has directed some episodes of iZombie, is going to be directing the pilot and producing the series. And it begins filming in September, so it's coming up. So the basic idea of this is it's a spin on the Arthurian legend from the perspective of Nimue, the Lady of the Lake, or who becomes the Lady of the Lake. This is her before she's the Lady of the Lake. And it kind of sees her eventuality as the Lady of the Lake as like a tragic story, basically.
Okay, right. And
it's going to take the guise of like a coming of age story, and it's going to feature characters like Arthur, who's like a mercenary in this, and they're trying to find Merlin and trying to deliver to Merlin this ancient sword. Gee, I wonder what sword that is.
It's the Buster Blade. It's the Master Sword.
The Master Sword, yes. Nimue is going to be portrayed by Catherine Langford, who's in 13 Reasons Why. She's the suicidee of that series. She was also, did you know she was originally going to be in Avengers Endgame? And spoilers for Avengers Endgame right now. She was going to play an adult version of Morgan Stark.
Oh,
so
okay.
when he snapped to wipe out Thanos, you know how like in Infinity War, when Thanos snapped, he had like a vision of like young Gamora?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like when Tony snapped, he was going to have a vision of, adults or, young adults Morgan.
I'm glad they didn't. That would have been just too much on the cheese factor, on the saccharin factor, like that's just like piling it on. I'm glad that they cut that, to be honest.
It's interesting though, because they had announced that actress being involved in Avengers Endgame, and it was like this whole like mystery role, like who's she going to be playing, and everybody was guessing. The movie came out and she was like nowhere to be seen in it. And they filmed it, I guess, but they cut it. So, maybe you'll see her when Avengers Endgame hits DVD.
Yeah, maybe.
Blu-ray.
Perhaps.
This is also going to star Devin Terrell, who I think is going to be playing Arthur, and they're going to be doing like a little bit of a switch here because he's a black actor. He played Obama in the movie Barry. Have you ever seen that movie or heard of it? It's a movie about a young Barack Obama.
No, I've never seen or heard of that.
So, funny enough, I watched that with my sister and my dad, and my sister and I did it as a joke. We started up the movie without saying what it was about because my dad's like super Republican and he hates Obama. And so we just wanted to see how long it would take him to realize he was watching a movie about Obama.
Uh-huh.
And
did he watch the whole movie?
Once he realized what it was, he basically just decided he wanted to watch the rest, but he wanted to hate watch it. So like Chris, my sister and I were just sitting there like very uncomfortable through the rest of the movie as he's just like glowering at the screen the whole time.
That's awesome.
It kind of backfired on us.
No, it's great because you've got him to watch a movie about Obama that wasn't a movie trying to like tear him down or make him out to be the devil the entire time. So
yeah, except he just sees it all as bullshit. And...
yeah, but you got him to watch it. He sat down and watched it. That is minor victories.
So this series is also going to feature Gustav Skarsgård, one of the Skarsgård brothers. So if you know, like basically all the Skarsgård brothers are famous actors.
One of them,
Alexander was in True Blood. One of them's Pennywise in It.
No, one of them is literally an evil clown.
Yes,
in real life.
Gustav was in Vikings. He played Floki. He was kind of like a weird guy in Vikings.
Oh.
He's kind of like the weirder of the Skarsgård brothers, I think. So, but anyways, Peter Mullen from Westworld's going to be in the series. I should say Gustav Skarsgård was also in Westworld. He was like the guy from HQ that came at the very end of or I don't know, at the end. I think he might have been in the first episode of the second season, but like in the furthest timeline.
Sure.
Yeah, and then Daniel Sharman, who is in Fear the Walking Dead, is in it as well. So yeah, that's Cursed, Arthurian legend retold by Frank Miller. He's, nobody's ever seen anything by Frank Miller before. He's hardly anybody to know,
Okay, so last one we got is Avatar: The Last Airbender.
Are you a fan of Avatar: The Last Airbender?
I can't believe they'd make a TV series based off that shitty movie. Wow. Why?
But seriously, are you a fan of the animated series?
I never watched it.
See, I haven't either, but I know people love Avatar: The Last Airbender. Of course, it was an animated series heavily based on like anime and also like the wushu style, like kung fu martial arts movies. The ones with all the wire work and fantastical elements and stuff. It's heavily based on like a combination of like that and anime. But it was an animated series on Nickelodeon. Netflix is now making a live action, fairly large budget, I believe, version of Avatar: The Last Airbender. And it's with the original creators of the show are going to be the showrunners, which is always a positive sign if you like the source material, that the original people are involved.
I don't watch source material. Yeah, hopefully for the fans that this is good, but I don't really have much of an opinion on it myself. I don't think this is going to be the next Game of Thrones. I'm sorry. It's just not that big.
Avatar's pretty huge, man. Like, people love that show.
It's huge amongst the cult following of people who watch Nickelodeon. That's not mainstream.
I think people were watching Nickelodeon for this, like, in spite of it being Nickelodeon, though. So this is on Netflix now, and it's not animated.
I don't know. I don't know. I don't think so.
A lot of these are I don't knows, though. I mean, a lot of these could be they could be Game of Thrones, or they could be that what's that one called, the Outpost.
I'm looking at if I had to rank these from most to least potential, I'd say most potential, Lord of the Rings, obviously the Game of Thrones spinoff, Blood Moon. So that's 1 and 2. 3 probably has Dark Materials
or Conan,
or maybe like The Witcher. The Witcher and Conan probably around the same rank, I'd say. Then you get like Chronicles of Narnia and Kingkiller Chronicles.
Don't forget, Wheel of Time is huge.
I'm getting there. Jeez, so then you got Wheel of Time and Dark Tower, and then I'd probably put Cursed and Avatar like on an equal level of things that might blow up. So that's where I'm at right now.
I'd like to say like Kingkiller, but I think the focus is going to be more on the movies.
Yeah, I think so too.
But yeah, I mean, a lot of them are going to be interesting. Like, a lot of them, it depends on how well they're made. If Dark Tower is made the way that fans have been wanting it to be made, that could be huge.
That could be huge, yeah. Yeah.
Wheel of Time, it's the same thing. Wheel of Time is massive. Like, before Game of Thrones became Game of Thrones on HBO, Wheel of Time was probably bigger than Game of Thrones was, as like a novel series. It was probably more famous, bigger, more lauded than Game of Thrones, or A Song of Ice and Fire, I should say. But then Game of Thrones became Game of Thrones. So what is the Wheel of Time going to become?
We don't know. It depends on like you said, all this depends on the execution. If the execution is botched, then, none of these are going to go anywhere if they screw up the execution.
Yeah, but that's it. Those are the fantasy shows that we think are contenders to be the next Game of Thrones, essentially. We're going to be going over in the next couple weeks. We'll go over, I think next week, I'm hoping to get a guest on, and we're going to do sci-fi. And so there's a lot of big sci-fi shows in development, like really big ones. Like, we talk about Lord of the Rings being a huge budget one for Amazon. It's absolutely dwarfed by the budget of one of their sci-fi projects they're working on, based on a Chinese novel called The Three-Body Problem. It's huge. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about, Galaxy Quest is getting a remake, Cowboy Bebop, stuff like that. So Why the Last Man? Lots of stuff. Then after that, we're going to be talking about stuff like Watchmen and Wild Cards and Lovecraft Country, Utopia. There's a lot coming up. The John Wick series, The Continental, about the hotel that's kind of prominently featured in that series. So we have a lot more stuff. So if you're like listening to this going like, why is it all these fantasy series? It's not guaranteed that the next water cooler show is going to be fantasy. That's just this week is fantasy. fantasy. We're covering more ground each week. So we're going to be doing this for the next couple weeks, the next 3 weeks, I think. So keep an eye out for that. Until then, here's what's coming up in the week ahead. We're recording this on Saturday, June 1st, 2019. But yesterday on Friday, the Deadwood movie came out on HBO. I haven't watched it yet. Have you?
Nope.
I am super excited. I just haven't had the time to watch it yet. What I have watched some of already, the first couple episodes, is Good Omens on Amazon Prime. And it's good, but it's schlocky. It's kind of good in like that Doctor Who kind of way, where like it's never going to be like as mainstream as like a Game of Thrones or something. So it's not the kind of thing that would make that list. Plus it's a miniseries. It's going to be wrapped up in one season, which makes it a little different. Also, When They See Us, the miniseries, comes to Netflix. This is about the, God, what's that called? It's the Central Park Five. Is it the Central Park Five? It's about these 5 young black men that were like basically accused and prosecuted of a crime that they didn't commit, and like the whole thing about it's a big deal kind of miniseries about racial equality and stuff that's coming out on Netflix. That's out now. So Bad Blood also hit Netflix. How to Sell Drugs Online Fast came to Netflix, and Swamp Thing debuted on DC Universe. So yeah, that's a lot for just yesterday, man. Today, Arthdale Chronicles came to Netflix. It's like a foreign fantasy series. On Sunday, June 2nd, American Princess comes to Lifetime. I normally wouldn't even mention a Lifetime series, but Genji Kohan is attached from Orange is the New Black, Weeds, and Glow. So that could make it interesting. Luther is back on BBC America on June 2nd. So that's Idris Elba. He's washing the shame of the Dark Tower movie off of him by returning to TV for a little bit. Perpetual Grace Ltd. is coming to Epic. Fear the Walking Dead is returning to AMC. Nosferatu to AMC. You know Joe Hill, right? You've read some of his stuff?
Right.
So this is one of his projects on AMC. Burden of Proof is back on the CW as well. On Monday, June 3rd, Malibu Rescue comes to Netflix. On Wednesday, June 5th, The Handmaid's Tale returns up to Hulu to depress everybody. Grownish is back on Freeform. And Black Mirror on Netflix. That's a big one. We're going to have to talk about that at some point later down the line. We'll have to do like a Black Mirror episode. Then on Thursday, June 6th, Queen of the South returns on USA. And on Friday, June 7th, 3% returns on Netflix. Armistead Maupin's Tales of the City comes to Netflix. This is a series it started as like a mini series on I think like CBS, and then it had like 2 follow-up series on like Showtime, like over like decades, the course of like decades, and now it's come to Netflix. It's a drama about people's lives in a city, predominantly with lesbian characters and kind of like their lifestyle in the city. So it's a really big project, not necessarily the kind of like genre and focus that we would normally talk about on this show, but it's kind of a big deal still. And Designated Survivor comes to Netflix, and they've taken the freedom that Netflix provides them to mature up the series a bit, make it a little bit more graphic, add in some cuss words. They went a little edgelord on it.
Right.
So if you like Designated Survivor, don't be surprised that, President Jack Bauer starts throwing in some F-bombs or something. But yeah, so that's it. Next week, we're going to be talking about probably the sci-fi shows we have on this list. Until then, you can reach me on Twitter. I'm at Tyson Gifford. You can reach Will. He is at FoxLaHero. You can check out our Facebook page and our YouTube channel, as well as our site, thetotalscreen.com. You can subscribe to the podcast through any major podcast client like iTunes or Pocket Cast. And the entire backlog of our podcast is available on our YouTube channel. So thank you, everybody, for listening. Good night.
Good night.
If you would like to reach out to us and make a comment, send an email to contact@thetotalscreen.com. Stay tuned to The Total Screen for the very best